We'll now cover Reading 4, CFA Institute Research Objectivity Standards, sometimes referred to as CFA Institute ROS. There are two simple learning objectives here. Number one, explain the objectives of the research objectivity standards. And then number two, we also need to be able to evaluate company policies and practices related to research objectivity and distinguish between changes required and changes recommended for compliance with the research objectivity standards. Before we move on, let's just get a high-level understanding of research objectivity standards. All this means, in very simple terms, is that if you are a research analyst and you are preparing research reports, then your work, your research analysis and the document or the research report that you produce should be completely objective. The research and your recommendations should not be biased by anyone, and that includes your management within the company that you operate in, or your clients, or the issuing company about which you are writing a research report. So that essentially is what the research objectivity standards are all about. You will notice that there is a very direct link between the research objectivity standards and the CFA Institute Code of Ethics. You studied the Code of Ethics in level 1 and then again in level 2 in the first couple of readings we talked about the Code of Ethics, and in fact the 7 standards that you study in level 1 and level 2 are based on the Code of Ethics. Similarly, the research objectivity standards are based on the same Code of Ethics. And what you will therefore find is, as we go over the research objectivity standards, they will look extremely familiar. A lot of the material, it will seem like, is coming straight out of the 7 standards. But the difference is that all the text that you will see here is based on research related matters. The way I will structure this lecture is quite straightforward. I am essentially going to read out the most important excerpts from this reading, and a good way to perhaps use this lecture is that you download it on a mobile or a handheld device, and you can simply listen to this lecture on your way to work, and that will help you remember the research objectivity standards. The CFA Institute recommends that firms work to achieve the following 5 objectives when designing policies and procedures to implement the research objectivity standards. A. To prepare research reports, make investment recommendations, and take investment actions, and develop policies, procedures, and disclosures that always place the interests of investing clients before their employees or the firm's interests. So as we saw earlier in the 7 standards, the interests of the investing clients always come first. To facilitate full, fair, meaningful, and specific disclosures of potential and actual conflicts of interest of the firm or its employees to its current and prospective clients. C. To promote the creation and maintenance of effective policies and procedures that would minimize and manage conflicts of interest that may jeopardize the independence and objectivity of research. D. To support self-regulation through voluntary industry development of and adherence to specific, measurable, and demonstrable standards that promote and reward independent and objective research. E. to provide a work environment for all investment professionals that supports, encourages, and rewards ethical behavior and supports CFA Institute members, CFA charter holders, and CFA candidates in their adherence to the CFA Institute code and standards. Those were the high-level objectives. Now in section 4 of this reading, we will get into the actual research objectivity standards. First, an introductory remark on the standards. The following standards are applicable to firms such as investment banks, broker-dealers, and independent research firms that employ investment professionals to research issuers and make recommendations about these issuers' securities, and that sell these research reports and recommendations for either hard currency or soft commissions. Now, this allusion to soft commissions refers to the soft dollar arrangements that we talked about in an earlier reading. The point here is that if you are a brokerage firm and you create sell-side research, at times you are providing that sell-side research to an investment manager, where the investment manager is not paying you hard dollars for this research report. And the point here is, even if dollars are not being explicitly paid for this research, the research objectivity standards should still apply. In other words, the research analyst creating the reports here needs to be completely objective, regardless of whether anyone is explicitly paying for that research report. Now let's get into the standards, and here again I'm simply reading the standards from the curriculum. What I am going over here are the requirements under the research objectivity standards, and I will briefly mention the recommendations on each standard as we move along. Standard 1, research objectivity policy. Firms must have a formal written policy on the independence and objectivity of research that must be made available to clients and prospective clients, both investing and corporate, and secondly, disseminate to all firm employees. B, supervisory procedures that reasonably ensure that the firm and its covered employees comply with the provisions of the policy and all applicable laws and regulations. And C, a senior officer in the firm who attests annually to client and prospective clients to the firm's implementation of and adherence to the policy. Now let's make sure we understand this concept of a covered employee. This definition is given in the curriculum. So covered employees are firm employees who conduct research, write research reports, and or make investment recommendations or assist in the research process. It can also include employees who take investment actions on behalf of clients or the firm, or who come in contact with investment recommendations or decisions during the decision-making process. And finally, people in the firm who may benefit personally or professionally from including research reports or recommendations. So in simplistic terms, you can think of covered employees as the employees of the firm who are involved in any way in this research report creation process. And now a few quick words on the recommended actions and procedures under standard number 1. And again, I'm reading just excerpts from the recommendations part of this reading. An effective research objectivity policy would clearly identify and describe the job title, function, and department of covered employees. So that's one point where the roles, responsibilities are clearly articulated. Secondly, covered employees should be regularly trained on their responsibilities. 3, there should be full disclosure of conflicts of interest that covered employees may face. 4, the firm should make clear what are the factors on which the compensation of research analysts is based. And finally, firms should disclose in the policy the conditions under which a research report can be published. So those are some of the major recommendations. If you want, you can read this segment from the curriculum in detail, but I think as long as you understand the main points I just highlighted, you are in good shape. Standard 2 of ROS, public appearances. Firms that permit research analysts and other covered employees to present and discuss their research and recommendations in public appearances must require those employees to fully disclose personal and firm conflicts of interest to the host or interviewer and whenever possible to the audience. So that is fairly self-explanatory. In the recommendations segment of this standard, all the curriculum does is identifies what we mean by public appearances, and it points out that that could include seminars, forums, radio shows, TV shows, maybe discussions on internet forums, and so on. Some of the points made here include that whoever is making a public appearance should ensure that the audience has sufficient information to make informed judgments about the objectivity of the research and recommendations. Covered employees who make public appearances should be prepared to make full disclosure of all conflicts. Firms should provide the full research report at a reasonable price. So those are some of the major recommendations under this standard. 3, reasonable and adequate basis, and this should look very familiar from the 7 standards that you have studied earlier. Firms must require research reports and recommendations to have a basis that can be substantiated as reasonable and adequate. An individual employee, supervisory analyst who is someone other than the author, or a group of employees, review committee, must be appointed to review and approve all research reports and recommendations. So again, this is fairly straightforward. The recommendation segment here is rather brief. I'll read the main point from the curriculum. Firms should develop detailed written guidelines for research analysts, supervisory analysts, and review committees that establish due diligence procedures for judging whether or not there is a reasonable and adequate basis for a particular recommendation. Standard 4, investment banking. Firms that engage in or collaborate on investment banking activities must A. Establish and implement effective policies and procedures that, number 1, segregate research analysts from the investment banking department, and 2, ensure that investment banking objectives or employees do not have the ability to influence or affect research or recommendations. Now, we've seen this in a lot of detail in the 7 standards, so this should be fairly familiar. B. Implement reporting structures and review procedures that ensure that research analysts do not report to and are not supervised or controlled by investment banking or other departments of the firm that could compromise the independence of the analysts. Many firms have a corporate finance department or another department with a slightly different name, but the point is that a research analyst should not be influenced by any other department in the firm. C. Implement procedures that prevent investment banking or corporate finance departments from reviewing, modifying, approving, or rejecting research reports and recommendations on their own authority. So these are fairly self-evident. In the case at the end of this reading, there are questions related to the points that you see over here. And in general, this is an important element to be on top of. Now I'll just read out some of the most important segments from the recommendations part of investment banking. Firms should prohibit research analysts from sharing with or communicating to members of the investment banking or corporate finance department prior to publication any section of the research report that might communicate the research analyst's proposed recommendation. Firms should implement quiet periods for initial public offerings and secondary offering of securities. The recommendation is that there be a quiet period of 30 days from issuance for IPOs and 10 calendar days from issuance for secondary offering. In case you are unclear about the definition of a quiet period, here is the definition from the curriculum. Quiet periods are periods during which covered employees are prohibited from issuing research reports or recommendations on and publicly speaking about a specific subject company. Five, research analyst compensation. Firms must establish and implement salary, bonus, and other compensation for research analysts that A. align compensation with the quality of research and the accuracy of the recommendations over time, and B. do not directly link compensation to investment banking or other corporate finance activities on which the analyst collaborated, either individually or in the aggregate. Again, fairly obvious points. The idea here is that for a research analyst to be completely objective, the compensation should be tied with the long-term accuracy of the recommendations, and there should be no influence based on how well, say, the investment banking division is doing. In terms of items from the recommendations segment on the standard, the most important point, I think, is that a firm should develop measurable criteria for assessing the quality of research. So when we talk about the quality of research, how do we measure that quality? And it is recommended that criteria be clearly defined that makes it possible to measure the quality of research. 6. Relationships with subject companies. Firms must implement policies and procedures that manage the working relationships that research analysts develop with the management of subject companies. You can think of subject companies as the companies that are issuing the securities that are being covered by the research analyst. Research analysts must be prohibited from A. sharing with or communicating to a subject company prior to publication any section of a research report that might communicate the research analyst's proposed recommendation, rating, or price target. And it's obvious that this helps ensure the objectivity of the research analyst. B. Directly or indirectly promising a subject company or other corporate issuer a favorable report or a specific price target, or from threatening to change reports, recommendations, or price targets. Again, Clearly, this is intended to ensure the objectivity of the research. On the recommendations side, the main points here are as follows. Maintaining appropriate working relationships with subject company personnel is an important aspect of the research analyst's responsibilities. Firms should establish and implement policies and procedures that govern these relationships, including policies regarding material gifts, company-sponsored and paid trips, and communications with company management. Firms should have a clear and written definition of what constitutes material. So the obvious point here is that if we are saying that it is acceptable to get non-material gifts from issuing company or a subject company, then the definition of what is material and what is not material needs to be very clear and documented. 7. Personal investments and trading. Firms must have policies and procedures that A. Manage covered employees' personal investments and trading activities effectively. B. Ensure that covered employees do not share information about the subject company or security with any person who could have the ability to trade in advance of, or front run, or otherwise disadvantage investing clients. You might recall this term from the 7 standards. So I want to highlight a couple of points here. First, let's just recall what front running means. Let's say that you are a research analyst and you hold shares in company X, and if you make a recommendation, a buy recommendation on company X, and this research report is going to be published, and just before publishing this report, you put in a buy order, a personal buy order for shares of company X. This is called front running, where what you are effectively doing is taking advantage of the fact that clients will potentially buy shares, and that will drive up the price after you have created shares for your own personal account. So this is front running, and it is not allowed under the research objectivity standards. Another larger point is that these standards don't say that employees cannot own the same shares that are being recommended or covered in the research done by the covered employee. All we are saying here is that there need to be guidelines such that any action that the covered employee takes does not disadvantage the clients in any way. Moving on to point C. Ensure that covered employees and members of their immediate families, the definition of immediate families is people living in the same house. So ensure that covered employees and members of their immediate families do not have the ability to trade in advance of or otherwise disadvantage investing clients relative to themselves or the firm. D. Prohibit covered employees and members of their immediate families from trading in a manner that is contrary to or inconsistent with the employees of firm's most recent published recommendations or ratings, except in circumstances of extreme financial hardship. So this is an interesting item that is mentioned in the case that you will have, where a research analyst has made a buy recommendation, but then he sells shares to buy an anniversary gift for his wife. And the question is that an acceptable thing to do? The answer is it's not acceptable, because the sale was not made under extreme financial hardship. E. Prohibit covered employees and members of their immediate families from purchasing or receiving securities prior to an IPO for subject companies and other companies in the industry or industries assigned. In terms of the recommendations, here is what the curriculum says. Permitting research analysts and other covered employees to invest and trade in the securities of subject companies and industries may better align their personal interests with the interests of investing clients, provided that precautions are taken to ensure that the interests of investing clients are always placed before the interests of the employee, members of their immediate families, and the firm. So again, the principle that the client comes first holds over here. Another point is that firms should have specific policies and procedures that adequately prevent front-running of investing client trade. So that point we have already covered. All the recommendations segment says is that the policies and procedures should be explicit and they should be documented. 8. Timeliness of research reports and recommendations. Firms must issue research reports on subject companies on a timely and regular basis. Now, this is rather obvious. The recommendations part says the following. It is recommended that reports and recommendations be issued at least quarterly, with additional updates recommended when there is an announcement of significant news or events by or that might impact the subject company. So the key point here is that reports should be issued at least quarterly. 9. Compliance and enforcement. Firms must A. have effective enforcement of their policies and compliance procedures to ensure research objectivity. B. Implement appropriate disciplinary sanctions for covered employees up to and including dismissal from the firm for violations. C. Monitor and audit the effectiveness of compliance procedures. And D. Maintain records of the results of internal audits. The recommendation segment here is quite brief, but I'll read the core statement here. Firms should disseminate a list of activities that would be considered violations and resulting disciplinary sanctions to all covered employees. So all the recommendations part is really saying is that the points outlined over here need to be clearly documented. So the list of activities that are considered violations should be made as explicit as possible so as to avoid subjectivity. Disclosure. Firms must provide full and fair disclosure of all conflicts of interest to which the firm or its covered employees are subject. Now, the curriculum has a rather long segment in the recommendations section, but I think this point here is fairly explicit, and I think the probability of being tested on the recommended procedures here is remote. So I will just read the core statement from the recommendations segment, which is as follows. To be full and fair, disclosures should be comprehensive and complete, be presented prominently in the supporting documents or on the firm's website, be written in plain language that is easily understood by the average reader, and be designed to inform rather than obscure the nature of the conflicts of interest faced by covered employees or the firm. So the point I think is made fairly well in this single statement, so just remember that. And finally, rating system. Firms must establish a rating system that A. is useful for investors and for investment decision making, and B. provides investors with information for assessing the suitability of the security to their own unique circumstances and constraints. The recommendation section here is quite interesting, and the main points are as follows. One-dimensional rating systems do not provide sufficient information with which investors can make informed decisions. The point here is that simply having a rating system that says buy, sell, or hold is not sufficient. Therefore, firms should implement rating systems that incorporate the following. Number one, recommendation or rating categories. Number two, time horizon categories. And number three, risk categories. Recommendations or rating categories can be absolute, example buy, hold, sell, or relative, example market outperform, neutral, or underperform. If the recommendation categories are relative, the firm should clearly identify the relevant benchmark, index, or objective. Time horizon categories should clearly identify whether the time horizon measures the period over which the expected price would be achieved or sustained. Firms should prohibit covered employees from communicating a rating or recommendation that is different from the current published rating or recommendation. Firms should provide clients and prospective clients with a complete description of the firm's rating system on request. Firms should regularly inform clients and prospective clients of the availability of this description and how a client or a prospective client can acquire this description. So that is it. We have covered the main parts of the 11 standards under research objectivity standards, and we've also talked briefly about the recommendations. Your job now is to practice as much as possible, and simply listening to this lecture, while it is important and good, but you only will internalize the concepts when you do the questions. There is a good case study at the end of this reading in the curriculum, and obviously you should also practice questions from past mock exams that have been published by the CFA Institute.